We came back through Transit Tunnel 7 with 3 machines. We'd left with 4. Collie's slot in the column stayed empty. Marsh held the rear. Torrance walked center. I kept point, because someone still had to read what was coming at us through the rock. The interface made that possible. My neural headset translated vibration data from the Mech's organic tissue into spatial pressure, like feeling the contour of a dark room through a heavy glove. 12 years on the interface had ground that sensation into instinct. A density change 40 meters to the left, a hollow pocket above the ceiling. Right now, the Ossivores were dispersing south, deep beneath the tunnel floor, pulling back after the kill. The attack that killed Collie. 2 hours ago, they collapsed a section of tunnel between his machine and mine. The collapse was surgical, too clean and deliberate for an ordinary cave-in. A single stratum punched through from below, dropping the ceiling in a 12-meter plug that sealed the passage like a cork in a pipe. By the time Marsh found an alternate route around the blockage, Collie's transmissions had gone to static. We reached his position 19 minutes too late. His cockpit was breached. The canopy had been peeled back from the torso, housing the way you'd strip bark from a branch. They'd pulled him out. The manual canopy charges had fired before the breach. 2 bolts were gone, 2 still seated, which meant Collie had tried to open the cockpit after the collapse and the warped housing had trapped him. The right manipulator was buried wrist-deep in the wall, fingers locked around a broken Ossivore hook. He'd kept fighting long enough to tear it off. The damage around the cockpit wasn't all combat damage. A band of deep integration tissue had been cut away from the torso in a clean crescent, following the interface trunk where the densest nerve bundles ran toward the pilot housing. The outer muscle was shredded. That inner strip was simply missing. The edges still contracted around the gap, as if trying to close it. I tagged the cut for recovery before we moved him. Whatever had done that had known which part of the machine to take. I'd called Pershing on the relay, gave the report. 3 returning, 1 killed in action. Request recovery crew for the Mech chassis. Chassis status, the dispatcher asked. Intact enough to tow. Pilot is not recoverable. Static for a moment. Then the logistics of it. Dock assignment, decontamination queue, maintenance priority. The war ran on logistics even when men died inside it. Pershing appeared on the interface before I saw it through the viewport. The city registered as a massive vertical interruption in the rock. A rift wall carved with load patterns, heat signatures, vibration from generators, water pumps, freight elevators running up the cliff face. Trench-City Pershing. 70,000 people bolted to the side of an underground cliff because the things that lived in the solid rock couldn't cross open vertical space. The rift was our moat. Everything else was their territory. We docked in the military bay on Tier 6. The gantry clamps locked onto my Mech's shoulders, took the weight off the legs. I powered down the organic drivetrain, the layered Ossivore muscle that wrapped around the machine's steel skeleton, that gave it locomotion, strength, the ability to move like a living thing instead of a forklift, then pulled the headset off. The world shrank. Spatial pressure vanished. The rock fell away in every direction. The cockpit remained. Steel walls, instrument panels, the harness cutting across my shoulders where it had settled during the 12-hour sortie. I sat there longer than I needed to. Collie had been with me for 4 sorties. Competent pilot. Clean comms, solid formation, no panic. The Ossivores had beaten him through placement, choosing the right stratum and the right moment. They'd also done something else, something I hadn't reported yet because I wanted to see the engagement telemetry before I said it out loud. During the fight, the pack had ignored 2 supply sleds sitting exposed on the tunnel rail. Soft targets, unarmoured, full of hydraulic fluid, ammunition, food stores. The Ossivores had passed them without contact. They'd converged on the Mechs instead. On my Mech first, the command unit, distinguishable from the others only by a different sensor array on the dorsal housing, they'd committed to me before they'd committed to anyone else, then redirected to Collie when Marsh closed the distance. Pack predators choose soft prey over armoured threats. Command units mean nothing to them. I climbed out of the cockpit, dropped to the bay floor, handed my headset to the deck crew. My legs were stiff. The maintenance bay stretched around me. A vaulted cavern with gantry rails running across the ceiling, machine tools bolted to the rock walls, work crews in grease-stained coveralls moving between the 3 mechs already clamped in their berths. The machines looked like what they were, 12-meter bipedal warframes grown from the tissue of the creatures that wanted to kill us, wrapped around welded steel skeletons, carrying rotary cannons, thermal lances, seismic harpoons. They had the bulk of Ossivores because the muscle tissue shaped itself according to its own biological blueprint, no matter what skeleton you seeded it on. We called them Marrow Engines because the organic meat grew out from the marrow cavities of the steel bones the foundries planted it in. I found Dunlap in Recovery Bay 3, where a tow crew had already delivered Collie's wrecked machine. Dunlap was the senior tissue technician on Pershing, a thin man in his 50s who'd been growing mech tissue longer than I'd been piloting it. He stood on a scaffold beside the mech's exposed torso, running a handheld sensor across the torn muscle. He kept the sensor moving without looking up. How bad? Chassis is salvageable. Cockpit housing needs full replacement. Organic integration is where it gets strange. The mech's torso was laid open where the Ossivores had breached it. Collie's blood had dried brown on the cockpit frame. But the organic tissue, the dense fibrous muscle that formed the mech's outer body, was still contracting. Slow, rhythmic tightenings in the deep fibers, visible as waves that rolled through the surface layer every few seconds. In a living mech with an active pilot, that was normal. The tissue responded to the neural interface, kept baseline tension in the musculature. But Collie was dead. His headset had been destroyed with the cockpit. There was no interface signal. Should have gone dormant within 20 minutes of pilot death, Dunlap said. This has been active for over 3 hours. Contractions are regular. Interval is about 4 seconds. External stimulus. That's what I assumed. But there's nothing in this bay that should trigger a response. No vibration source, no electromagnetic signal on any frequency we monitor. I swept the full range. He leaned over the scaffold railing, looked down at me. Captain, it's responding to something outside my instrument capability. I watched the tissue. The contractions moved through it like something breathing, a tightening that travelled along the fibre grain, relaxed, repeated. Tissue that should have been dead. Listening to something I couldn't see. Can I try something? I said. Dunlap handed me a spare headset from the tool rack. Diagnostic model, lower resolution than a combat unit, but compatible with raw tissue. I pressed it against the exposed muscle just above the breech line, where the fibre layer was thickest. The interface engaged. Spatial pressure flooded back, but wrong. This wasn't my mech's tissue feeding me a clean read of the surrounding rock. This was noise. Overlapping vibration from too many sources roaring over each other. I nearly pulled back. Then the noise resolved into a directional pull. Everything was pulling one way, down, deep below Pershing, far past the lowest tier, past the industrial caverns, past the geothermal taps. Something was there. I couldn't read its shape or size. But every fibre in the dead tissue was straining toward whatever sat at the bottom of that signal, the way iron filings strain toward a magnet beneath the table. I pulled the headset off, handed it back to Dunlap. What did you get? He asked. Directional pull. Something deep. Below us. Dunlap wrote that down without comment. He'd learned years ago that pilot impressions through the interface were worth recording even when they couldn't be verified. My comm unit buzzed. Dispatch. Captain Rylan, report to command level. Briefing room 2. Colonel Hargrove. I looked at Dunlap. Keep that tissue alive. Don't let anyone scrap it. Wasn't planning to. I left the maintenance bay carrying 2 things I couldn't explain. The Ossivores were choosing their targets with a specificity that exceeded pack behaviour. Dead mech tissue was listening to something underground. Briefing room 2 was a concrete box on Pershing's command level, 3 tiers above the military docks. Fluorescent strips in the ceiling. A projection table showing a topographic map of the tunnel network radiating out from Pershing. Transit routes, freight lines, survey bores, perimeter monitors. Colonel Hargrove stood at the table with a datapad. He was alone. "Close the door," he said. I closed it. Hargrove was career military, 52. He didn't ask about Collie. He'd already read my report. Macon went dark 31 hours ago. I knew Macon. Trench-City Macon, roughly 300 kilometers through the deep tunnel network built into the eastern wall of the Avery Rift. Smaller than Pershing. Population around 40,000. 2 Marrow Engines in its garrison. "Transit tunnels?" I asked. "Every route we've mapped has collapsed. Freight elevators were destroyed. Last transmissions described coordinated attacks on structural supports, water systems, and power conduits." He set the datapad on the table. "In sequence, Captain. They hit water reclamation first, then power, then walls on the residential tiers. That's a siege pattern, which Ossivores don't run," Hargrove said. He pulled up a secondary display. Deployment records for Macon's garrison. 2 Marrow Engines, both deployed in response to the initial tunnel collapses, both destroyed within the first engagement. "They went after the Mechs first," I said. "According to the final transmissions, both machines were priority targets. Once they were down, the Ossivores shifted to infrastructure." Hargrove looked at me across the table. "Same pattern you reported from today's sortie, different scale." The map showed Macon as a cluster of tier markers on the rift wall, connected to Pershing by a branching web of tunnel lines. Most of those lines now carried red hash marks. Collapsed. Impassable. "What do you need from me, Colonel?" "A 4 Mech squad through the deep tunnels to Macon. Objective is the weapons research annex on the lower military tier." "What's in the annex?" "Next-generation tissue cultivation. Faster growth cycles, improved neural integration, higher yield from smaller cultures. The program's been running for 2 years. It's our best path to scaling mech production faster than we're losing units." "Cultivation work needs a weapons annex?" "The cultures are military material. The growth process, integration tolerances, failure data, all classified. Then transmit the annex files before we leave. No field transmission." Hargrove closed the deployment display with one hand. "You recover the personnel and physical storage. If neither is possible, you verify destruction. Any surviving culture stays sealed. If containment has failed, you destroy what remains before you withdraw." That was more security than a production program required. "You want me to recover the research?" "Research personnel if they're alive, data storage if they're not. If the annex has been physically breached, I need you to assess what remains." He paused. "This is the priority target, Captain, the annex. The city has 40,000 people. If the infrastructure attacks were as systematic as the transmissions describe, the civilian population is already in water crisis. Sealed environment, no reclamation. That's days, not weeks. I'm not ordering you to save Macon. I'm ordering you to reach the annex." I wanted to argue. There wasn't an argument to make. 40,000 people in a sealed city with no water was a problem with one answer. Hargrove knew it. I knew it. 4 machines, I said. 300 kilometers of hostile tunnel. That's thin. That's what exists. Pershing's garrison is down to 7 units, 6 operational. 2 are committed to perimeter defense. 1 is in the foundry for tissue regrowth. I'm giving you 4. Which means Pershing has 0 reserve if something hits us while you're gone," Hargrove said. 2 other trench cities have requested mech support this week. I turned them both down. "Who's on my squad?" "Marsh Torrance and Lieutenant Pratt. Pratt has 8 months of combat experience. Pratt has interface compatibility scores in the 94th percentile. He's assigned by General Montgomery's office. Montgomery's office doesn't run squad composition." "Pratt is on your squad," Hargrove said. "That decision is above both of us." I knew what it meant. Pratt had family on Pershing's civilian council. That connection could place a young officer where he could build a service record. Montgomery wanted him decorated. I was the vehicle. "I understand the order," I said. I briefed the squad in the ready room an hour later. Marsh listened, asked a few logistical questions, then said nothing more. 11 years in the cockpit, he'd seen cities go dark before. Torrance asked about ammunition loads, coolant reserves and tunnel clearances on the deep route. Pratt asked when we were leaving. "We launch at 0400 7 hours from now," I said. "I'll be ready." At 24, he was fit, with strong scores from controlled exercises against tethered targets. His training had never shown him what the Ossivores did to Collie's cockpit, or forced him to hold formation while the rock above fractured into falling slabs. Combat would cost him that confidence soon. I just didn't want it costing my squad. During the prep cycle, ammunition loading, coolant top-offs, hydraulic checks, I watched the armory crew seat 2 bolts in each seismic launcher. A bolt had to penetrate mineralized plate and lock into the bone lattice before its tuned impulse could travel through the armor into the softer structures beneath. A bad angle wasted half our supply. A clean one stopped an adult. Pratt caught an armorer calibrating his second bolt for standard transit stone instead of the denser Avery strata. A low-power test pulse scattered through the cradle, and his interface caught the return before the diagnostic rack did. "That setting will bleed the impulse into the rock," he said. The armorer checked and reset it. Pratt's score meant something outside an exercise. Dunlap found me in the corridor outside the foundry level. He held his datapad in both hands. "Got something else," he said. He walked me to the foundry observation gallery, a windowed corridor overlooking the tissue cultivation bay. Below us, 6 tanks the size of transit cars sat in a row, each filled with nutrient gel. Inside each tank, a mass of cultivated ossivore tissue, the raw material for growing new mechs. The seed cultures were supposed to expand outward evenly from their nutrient feeds, filling the tanks in uniform spheres. They weren't uniform. Every mass in every tank had extended toward the same wall. The tissue had elongated, stretched, pushed against the tank glass on one side, while leaving empty gel behind it on the other. 6 tanks, 6 identical distortions, like 6 animals pressed against the bars of their cages, all trying to reach the same thing. "Started about 48 hours ago," Dunlap said. "Growth rate is up 11% with no change in nutrient feed. But the directionality, that's unprecedented. I've never seen cultured tissue exhibit spatial bias." "Which direction?" Dunlap pointed through the gallery window toward the far wall of the cultivation bay. "East-southeast, roughly consistent with the deep tunnel bearing toward the Avery Rift. Toward Macon." I looked at the tissue pressing against the tank walls. Living meat straining in one direction. The same direction the dead tissue in Collie's mech had been reaching for when I'd touched it through the interface. "Whatever's down there," I said. "The tissue knows about it." "The tissue is ossivore," Dunlap said. "Cultivated, modified, bonded to steel. But at the cellular level, it's still their biology. If something in the wild population is broadcasting a signal on a channel our instruments can't detect." He stopped. I was about to walk 4 of those machines into 300 kilometers of hostile tunnel, trusting the tissue inside them to tell me where the enemy was. The tissue was already telling me. It was pointing somewhere deep beneath us, straining toward it. I just didn't know what it had found. We launched at 0400. 4 Marrow engines in column formation, full combat load. I walked point. Marsh held the rear. Torrance took center-left. Pratt center-right. The transit tunnel was armored for the first 80 kilometers. Reinforced walls, rail tracks for freight transport, relay stations every 20 clicks for comm support. Standard deep-route infrastructure, built to last. The damage started at kilometer 40. Caved sections patched with quick-set concrete by repair crews who'd abandoned clean work long ago. Rail segments fused to the tunnel floor where heat had warped them. Glassed rock where ossivores had burrowed through the walls, their superheated forelimbs turning stone to smooth slag that cooled behind them in crusted ridges. Some of the damage was months old, some still radiated residual warmth. Relay Station 3 was rubble, The entire housing cratered inward, buried under a ceiling section that had dropped clean. Station 4 was standing, but dead. Its transmitter had been smashed by something that reached through the wall, crushed the equipment casing, then withdrew. The breach hole was still visible, a perfect bore through the reinforced concrete, 4 hand-widths across, edges glassed smooth. Something had punched through, killed the relay, pulled back. After Station 4, every transmission I sent to Pershing hit dead air. We were on our own. "I'm reading low return movement rear right, 230 meters out," Pratt said. "It corrected when we changed grade." I widened my interface field. At first I read only the wash of our own footfalls through layered rock. Then the weak signatures separated from it. Pratt had caught them before I had. Not because they were stronger on his machine, but because he could distinguish finer overlap in the tissue feed. My interface fed me a constant read of the surrounding rock. I kept the sensitivity high, scanning every vector for movement. What I found was wrong. Contacts were out there. Multiple signatures on several bearings, holding at 200 meters minimum distance on all sides. They were maintaining spacing, pacing us at a steady distance. Their formation matched an escort around a convoy. Ossivores closed on prey or scattered from a threat. This pack shadowed us and maintained intervals. "Can you confirm it, Marsh?" I asked over comms. "I see it," Marsh said. "Net pattern, 6 contacts minimum, maybe 8. They've been tracking us since we passed Relay 4. Torrance cut in. "Want me to ping active seismic? Might give us a better count." "Leave it passive. Don't give them more data than they already have." We pushed on. The tunnel narrowed at kilometer 160, a geological choke point where the transit bore passed through a harder stratum. The walls squeezed in. 2 mechs abreast at best. The contact pattern changed. 4 of the trailing signatures accelerated, splitting into pairs. 1 pair climbed above us, 1 dropped below. "Contacts on multiple vectors," I called. "Weapons free." They hit from 2 directions at once. The ceiling ruptured first. 3 juvenile ossivores, each roughly 4 meters long, encased in overlapping plates of mineralized bone, forelimbs tipped with mineral-dense hooks, burst through the rock above Torrance's position. They dropped onto his mech's dorsal housing, clawing at the sensor array, prying at the joint seams where the steel plating was thinnest. The floor buckled half a second later. A full-grown adult, 8 meters wider than the tunnel bore, shovel limbs carving through reinforced concrete the way a blade goes through river clay, erupted beneath Marsh's rear position. A second adult followed, hammering upward between Torrance's mech and mine. The tunnel floor heaved. My mech lurched sideways. Warning indicators lit across the cockpit. I pivoted. The tunnel gave me no room. My mech's shoulder ground against the wall as I brought the rotary cannon to bear. I fired into the ceiling breach, short bursts, controlled, targeting the juveniles on Torrance's back. The cannon rounds punched through bone plate in bursts of calcium dust. 1 juvenile dropped, thrashing, hit the tunnel floor on its back with its legs still working. The second lost a forelimb at the shoulder joint, slid off Torrance's mech, hit the wall. "Floor contact 6 o'clock, Marsh called. His cannon opened up behind me, a deeper, heavier concussion. Then his seismic harpoon fired. The sound travelled through the rock itself. The mech's tissue registered the shockwave as a white flash of spatial pressure through my interface. The bolt punched through the adult's shoulder plate and locked. The impulse fired. The adult beneath Marsh's position convulsed. Its subsonic scream rattled my cockpit instruments and travelled up through my mech's feet. Then it went still. The second adult was directly below me. I felt it through the tissue before my instruments registered the seismic spike. The floor buckled under my right foot. I shifted weight left. The rock split. A shovel limb the width of my cockpit punched upward through the gap, caught the underside of my hip actuator, steel bent, plating crumpled. My machine staggered. I grabbed the tunnel wall with my mech's left hand to keep from going down. I fired the seismic harpoon straight through the gap in the floor. The bolt punched through rock and plate, locked and fired its impulse. The adult's body locked rigid. Its shovel limb raked sideways as it died, tearing a ragged gash through my mech's lower torso plating before it fell back into the hole it had carved. "Pratt, cover the breach," I ordered. Nothing. Pratt's mech had stopped moving. It stood in the column, arms locked at its sides, the thermal lance cold. Through the dust, I could see the machine's posture, rigid, frozen mid-step. He'd locked up. "Pratt, respond! There's too many, I can't get a... Use your lance on the ceiling breach. Fire now, angled east away from the column." He fired. But the angle was off. 15 degrees too far west, too close to the wall the Ossivores had already weakened from above. The thermal beam superheated a section of stressed rock that had been bearing the weight of the collapse above us. The stone fractured. A slab the size of a freight car separated from the ceiling, dropped behind Torrance's position, hit the tunnel floor with a concussion that knocked my mech half a step forward. Dust rolled through the passage. Rubble filled the tunnel behind us, enough to block any quick retreat without sealing the route completely. The remaining juvenile, the one missing a forelimb, was still alive. It had wedged itself into the wall breach above Torrance. He reached up with his mech's left hand, seized it by the hindquarters, ripped it free. It weighed close to a ton. He threw it down the tunnel. It hit the ground, slid 10 meters, stopped moving. Quiet. The dust hung in the air. My cockpit fans cycled, pulling filtered oxygen through the breather system. Through the interface, I tracked the remaining contacts. They were withdrawing. In sequence, rear elements first, then flankers, then the forward scouts. Orderly, controlled. They'd retreated the way a patrol retreats after gathering what it came for. Marsh reported in. Minor damage to his left foot assembly. Torrance's right leg actuator was compromised. Something had buckled in the knee joint during the floor breach, giving his stride a grinding hitch. My hip plating was torn but functional. Pratt's mech was untouched. I switched to a private channel with Pratt. "You froze. Your lance hit the wrong section of wall. That collapse blocked our fallback route." "I didn't. The contacts were everywhere. I couldn't prioritize." "You had one target, the ceiling breach. You missed it by 15 degrees because you didn't check your angle before you pulled the trigger." I let that sit for a beat. "If you lock up again, someone in this column dies." Silence. "Tell me you understand, Lieutenant." "Yes, sir." Then before I changed channels. "Give me one vector next time. Right wall, everything above horizontal. You hold it unless I move you. Don't chase a contact across the column." "Right wall, above horizontal." He repeated it without defensiveness, a procedure he could execute or fail. I switched back to squad comms. "Marsh, give me your assessment." "Probing action," Marsh said. "Juveniles as distraction, adults testing our floor response. They committed just enough force to read our reaction time, weapons spread, formation discipline. Then they pulled back in sequence, maintained spacing throughout the withdrawal." A pause. They were studying us. I'd felt it too. The attack had the structure of an exercise. Controlled variables, limited engagement, clean exit. They'd left with whatever they'd learned. Something else. The section of wall that Pratt's lance had destabilized. I ran the interface over the rock around the collapse. Stress fractures. Old ones, weeks old at least. Something had weakened that stratum before we'd arrived. Pratt's thermal blast had triggered a collapse the Ossivores had already prepared. They'd pre-weakened our retreat route. Pratt had saved them the trouble of springing it themselves. "We can clear the rubble," Torrance said. 2, maybe 3 hours. "In hostile territory, with that net still holding around us." I pulled up what navigation data we had. The transit tunnel continued east toward Macon through 2 more choke points, where the geology narrowed. If the Ossivores had prepared this one, the others were compromised too. Marsh saw it before I said it. "The branch tunnel, kilometer 168. Older bore, pre-war survey route, not on current traffic charts." "That route goes deeper," Torrance said. "Geologically unstable strata, no relay infrastructure. And no pre-staged kill zones," I said. Through the interface, I felt the contact net. Still there. still spaced around us at 200 meters. The Ossivores held their 200-meter spacing after the engagement. They were waiting. "We take the branch," I said. "Single file. Torrance, your actuator. Can you make the descent?" "It'll hold." "What do you think, Marsh?" "Your call, Captain." Which was Marsh's way of saying he disagreed but would follow the order. We reached the branch at kilometer 168. The tunnel mouth was half the width of the transit bore, single file only. The rock inside was different, darker, layered with mineral veins that threw back muddy patterns on the interface. The readings were harder to interpret, less clean data, more noise. We descended. The transit tunnel fell away above us. The branch route dropped at a steep gradient, curving through fault lines, squeezing through sections where my Mech's shoulders scraped both walls. Torrance's damaged actuator ground metal against metal with every step. Pratt said nothing. Through the interface, I tracked the contact net. It shifted around us as we descended. The Ossivores adjusted their positions to match our new bearing. They redistributed around the branch tunnel the way water fills a new channel, finding the gaps, maintaining coverage, keeping us wrapped. They'd known about this route. They'd been waiting to see which way we'd go. We were descending deeper into their rock. The things in the dark were coming with us. The branch tunnel took us 11 hours deeper into the rock. The route descended through fractured strata, narrowing in places until my Mech's shoulders scraped both walls. Torrance's damaged actuator turned every step into a grinding complaint from the knee joint. Pratt kept formation. He hadn't spoken since the choke point. The Ossivore net held around us the entire descent, contacts at 200 meters, adjusting whenever we shifted bearing. They held their distance and accompanied us the way guards escort a prisoner to his cell. We climbed into Macon's upper tiers through a natural fissure that intersected the city's lowest mining level. The fissure opened into a freight corridor on the industrial tier, wide enough for 2 Mechs abreast. Tracks in the floor for ore carts, tool lockers bolted to the walls. The city was dead. I'd expected damage. Breach points, collapsed sections, the usual wreckage of an Ossivore incursion where force met architecture. What spread ahead of us was different. Macon had been dismantled. The water reclamation centre on Tier 4 had been breached from below. 3 boreholes punched through the floor at the exact points where the main distribution pipes passed closest to natural fissures in the rock. The Ossivores had tunnelled through those fissures, surfaced inside the sealed facility, sheared the pipes. They'd known the layout. They'd known which sections of floor were thinnest. The water reclamation centre was buried deep in Macon's core, behind multiple bulkheads, accessible only through locked service corridors. A pack predator doesn't find that. Something told it where to dig. We moved through the residential tiers. The collapse pattern there was structural. Walls along the rift face had been undermined from behind, dropping entire sections of habitation into the open rift. Apartments, corridors, generator rooms, all of it slid off the cliff wall in controlled slabs, the way demolition crews drop buildings. The Ossivores had removed the supports in sequence, bottom to top, so each section pulled the one above it down. I could trace the order by the rubble pattern, lower tiers first, then middle, then upper. Marsh walked beside me through a residential corridor that ended in open air, the floor continuing for another 10 meters past where the outer wall had been, jutting over the rift like a diving board. Personal effects sat on shelves inside exposed apartments. A child's shoe, a workbench with tools still clamped in place. Everything that hadn't fallen was exactly where its owner had left it. "They didn't swarm," Marsh said. "They took the city apart like they were reading a blueprint." "They were," I said. I believed it, though I couldn't see how. I ordered the squad toward the lower military tier. Torrance's actuator was getting worse. Each step produced a shudder that travelled through his Mech's frame, but he kept pace. As we descended through a service shaft between tiers, my interface registered movement below us. A single contact. Small, stationary, human. We found him in a pump station on Tier 7, a maintenance engineer named Broward, sealed inside the pump room behind a blast door the Ossivores had never breached. The room still had emergency water from the station's own reserve tank, ration packs from a supply cabinet, a chemical toilet. He'd been alone for 6 days. Broward was thin, unwashed, his maintenance coveralls hanging loose on his frame. He stood in the doorway of the pump station, staring up at 4 Marrow engines. His gaze kept shifting between the cockpits. "Who's in command?" he asked. "Captain Rylan, Trench-City Macon. I'm in command." "You came 300 kilometers?" His gaze moved across the 4 cockpits again. "What happened here, Mr. Broward?" He told us. The attack had started with the transit tunnels. Standard Ossivore behavior, collapsing access routes. Then nothing. Almost a full day of silence. Broward had been monitoring pump pressure from this station when the water system failed. The Ossivores had surfaced inside the reclamation center simultaneously from 3 boreholes. They'd destroyed the pumps, sheared the pipes, withdrawn. The whole incursion took less than 20 minutes. "After water went, the garrison deployed both engines," Broward said. "Pilot Garrett, pilot Sims, 2 machines. They went out through the lower mining access to engage." "How long did they last?" Broward looked at the floor. "First contact was maybe 40 minutes after deployment. I heard the cannon fire through the rock. You can feel it through the walls, you know how it is. Went on for about 6 minutes, then it stopped." He had still been watching the maintenance grid when the military feed failed. Garrett's transponder had moved towards Sims for support. A new collapse opened between them before he covered half the distance. Garrett's signal stopped 90 seconds later. Sims kept firing from the far side until something drove his engine below the sensor floor. His last movement trace went straight down. "They separated them first," Broward said. "Then they finished them one at a time. The Ossivores ignored everything else, every other target in the city. They went straight for the engines, both of them, like nothing else mattered. Same pattern, same priority. Kill the Mechs first, then take the city apart." "After the engines went down," Broward continued, "the power conduits were next. They came through the walls of the main junction room, Tier 3, Section 9, cut the primary feeds. Then they started on the walls." He looked up at me. "Captain, they hit the walls in order, bottom tier first. Each section pulled the one above it down. I watched it from a monitor before the feed died. It looked like someone had planned it." "You've been here 6 days. Any further Ossivore activity?" "They passed through twice. I could feel them through the walls. Heavy movement, multiple contacts, heading down, toward the lower military tier, toward the research annex." I looked at Marsh. He looked back. Neither of us said anything. The observer recess in Torrance's cockpit could carry Broward, but taking Macon's only known survivor into active contacts below the city was worse than leaving him behind the one door the Ossivores had ignored. Broward showed me the pump station's emergency carrier. It sent maintenance pulses through the metal water mains instead of the dead relays. One western line still reached toward the old freight levels and the branch bore. It couldn't reach Pershing, but it could push a distress signal far enough for a search unit already on the route to hear it. "Your return window?" he asked. 30 hours. If we're not back, transmit this code." I loaded the mission frequency and gave him one of Torrance's spare beacon cells. "Stay behind the door until you hear our identification sequence. You're coming back this way." That's the route I have. It wasn't a promise I could guarantee. I gave it to him anyway. We left Broward with a ration pack from Torrance's emergency stores and continued toward the annex. The weapons research annex occupied a reinforced section of Macon's lower military tier, heavy blast doors, independent power supply, its own air recycling. The blast doors had been torn off their tracks. Something had gripped the door edges, bent the steel outward, peeled the entrance open. The claw marks in the metal were spaced the width of an adult Ossivore's forelimb. Inside, the annex was wrecked. Workstations smashed. Data storage units had been broken systematically, each housing cracked open and each drive plate shattered. The research staff were dead. I counted 4 bodies in the main lab, 2 in the corridor. One of the researchers had reached the manual isolation station beside the cultivation wall. His hand was still closed around the purge lever. The lever had moved halfway before the linkage beneath it bent. A second body lay between the station and the nearest tank, with a portable thermal cutter beside her. She'd burned through the nutrient feed and started on the tank's lower seal, trying to ruin the culture or drop it into the floor drain before the Ossivores opened the room. The cut stopped 3 centimeters short. They had known what the real target was. They had almost denied it. But one section of the lab was different. The tissue cultivation tanks, 6 sealed units along the far wall, identical to the ones in Pershing's foundry, were intact. The tanks themselves hadn't been smashed. They'd been opened. The locking mechanisms had been pried loose from outside, the tank lids bent back. The nutrient gel had drained across the floor in a dried residue. The tissue was gone. The Ossivores had removed it intact, prying open the tanks and pulling the cultivated tissue free. The extraction marks on the tank interiors, long scraping gouges in the glass lining, were consistent with Ossivore forelimbs reaching inside. They'd come for the tissue. Everything else, the data, the staff, the equipment, they'd destroyed. The living Ossivore tissue, the cultures growing in those tanks, they'd carried away. Why would they take it? Torrance asked. He was standing at the open tanks, looking at the emptied interiors. I didn't have an answer. The tissue in those tanks was the same cultivated Ossivore muscle used to grow Mechs. It had value to us. What value would it have to them? Then the interface hit me like a wall. Vibration from below. Massive. Heavier than anything I'd registered in 12 years on the headset. It came up through my Mech's feet, through the legs, through the torso, into the cockpit where it resonated in the steel frame around me. Deep. Regular. A rhythm like a heartbeat, but slower. Intervals of perhaps 10 seconds between each surge. The tissue in my Mech responded to it. The organic musculature tightened across the machine's frame, straining downward, pulling toward the source the way the cultures in Pershing's foundry had strained toward the east wall of their tanks. "Are you getting this?" Marsh asked. "I'm getting it. Torrance, report." "I'm registering it," Torrance said. "My Mech's tissue is contracting on its own. I can feel it through the harness." Even Pratt spoke. "My readings are spiking. What is that?" Something enormous. Something deep below us, deeper than Macon's lowest tier, deeper than the mining levels, down in the raw rock, broadcasting on whatever channel the tissue communicated through, calling to the Ossivore biology inside our machines. I stood in the ruined annex with the emptied tanks behind me, the dead researchers around me, the whole dead city above me. The Ossivores had stripped this place. They'd killed the Mechs first, destroyed the research, taken the tissue. Then they'd torn the city down around it. Everything coordinated, everything sequenced. Whatever was broadcasting from below us was the reason. "We go down," I said. Marsh stepped his Mech forward. "We have intelligence. We've confirmed Macon is lost. The annex is destroyed. Mission parameters are met. We should return to Pershing with what we know." "What do we know, Marsh? The Ossivores can take a city apart and prioritize Mechs, but we knew that before we got here. Their reason and method are still hidden." I pointed toward the floor. Whatever is down there told them where to dig. It told them to take the tissue. It's the reason this city is dead. If we walk away now, we walk away from the only chance we'll get to see it. Marsh held my gaze through his viewport. I could see the shape of his face behind the armored glass. 4 Mechs, 1 damaged, 300 kilometers from support. No communications, no resupply. You want to go deeper? We go deeper. He held for a long moment. Then he stepped back into formation. "Your call, Captain." Which was exactly what he'd said about the branch tunnel. He disagreed. He'd follow the order. Torrance said nothing. Pratt said nothing. We descended. Below Macon's lowest tier, the built environment ended. Reinforced walls gave way to raw rock. The mining tunnels narrowed into natural fissures, vertical cracks in the strata, carved wider by water or heat or time. The rock changed as we went deeper. Glassed surfaces appeared, the residue of ossivore burrowing, stone melted smooth by superheated forelimbs and cooled into dark crusts. The marks grew denser, older layers beneath newer ones, accumulated over years. This wasn't recent activity. Something had been working this rock for a long time. The vibration through the interface grew with each 100 meters of descent. It pressed against my awareness the way deep water presses against a diver, constant, heavy, everywhere. My Mechs tissue was responding to it continuously now. The musculature contracted in slow waves that traveled down the limbs, synchronized with the rhythm from below. I could feel the machine trying to move on its own, pulling toward the source. I had to fight it through the controls to maintain my heading. We entered the cavity. The fissure opened into a vertical pocket in the rock, a natural geological formation roughly cylindrical, hundreds of meters across. My Mech's floodlights hit the far wall and lost themselves in the distance. The cavity dropped below us into darkness. It rose above us to a vaulted ceiling of fused stone. The walls were covered in ossivores, dozens of them, adults, 8 to 10 meters each, their bodies pressed flat against the rock face, shovel limbs anchored in crevices, bone plating radiating heat that distorted the air around them. They were motionless, arranged, spaced evenly across the cavity walls in concentric rings, oriented inward. Watching. They weren't attacking. At the center of the cavity, anchored to the floor by a mass of fused tissue that spread outward like the root system of a vast tree, was the brood matriarch. She was enormous. 40 meters from head to tail, wider than a transit tunnel, her body a ridged mountain of mineralized bone plate. Her forelimbs were folded beneath her, each one broad enough to collapse a reinforced corridor with a single stroke. Her head was a blunt wedge of armored bone, featureless except for the vibration-sensing organs that lined her jaw in rows of pitted indentations. She remained still. What surrounded her was worse. Embedded in the walls of the cavity, in the floor, in the root structure that connected the matriarch to the rock, wrecked Mechs. I counted 6 visible chassis, maybe more buried deeper in the tissue mass. Old machines. Some of them years old. I recognized the frame configuration of a Garrett-class engine that had been decommissioned before I made captain. Another was a heavy assault variant that Pershing had fielded during the Ridgeline campaign 3 years ago. The pilot's name had been Decker. I'd known him. The steel skeletons were crushed, corroded, stripped of weapons, but the organic tissue, the cultivated ossivore muscle that had once wrapped around those frames, was alive. It had grown. It had spread outward from each wrecked chassis, extending across the rock in sheets of fibrous muscle, connecting mech to mech, mech to wall, mech to matriarch. Thick ropes of tissue ran from the nearest chassis directly into the matriarch's body, fused with her own musculature at the junction points. The entire cavity was lined with it, a biological structure built from the harvested tissue of every marrow engine the Ossivores had ever destroyed, integrated into a single network centered on the brood matriarch. The network was alive. It contracted in slow waves that matched the rhythm I'd been feeling through my interface for hours. Each contraction traveled from the outer edges inward, converging on the matriarch. I understood. The neural interface worked because the mech tissue was ossivore tissue. We'd always known that. We'd treated it as a borrowed tool, their biology, our controls. But the tissue had never stopped being part of their species. The sensory channel that let me feel vibrations through the rock was the same channel the ossivores used to communicate with each other. We had plugged ourselves into their communication network. The matriarch had been harvesting that tissue from every mech destroyed in the field, integrating it into this network. Through it, she could detect every active mech in the tunnel system, every machine still carrying living ossivore tissue, every pilot still connected through a neural interface. She could feel where they went, what they were near, how the tunnels connected to the cities. Every deployment had drawn her a map. Every sortie had given her intelligence. Every pilot who'd used the interface, including me, especially me with my 12 years of deep-bonded instinct, had been feeding her everything she needed to take the trench cities apart. The realization landed in my chest like a physical weight. 12 years. Every time I'd praised the interface for its clarity, every time I'd trusted the spatial pressure to guide me through hostile rock, every time I'd told a junior pilot that the tissue was the best tool we had, the channel had been open in both directions. I'd been broadcasting. We'd all been broadcasting. They hadn't gotten smarter. We had taught them. The matriarch shifted. Every ossivore on the walls moved at once. They tightened the rings, closing the cavity's exits. Then they came. "Contact, all vectors!" I brought my cannon up. The first adult launched from the wall to my right, crossing the gap in a single lunge, bone plate shedding dust as it closed. I fired. The rounds punched into its shoulder joint, staggered it, but it kept coming. A second adult dropped from above, straight down onto Pratt's position. Pratt moved on the vector I'd given him. The adult came from above right, and his thermal lance met it before its forelimbs cleared the wall. The beam cut through the shoulder seam and sent it spinning past his cockpit. He held the sector. He didn't chase it. The matriarch adjusted. 3 ossivores hit him from outside that sector. The first struck his chest and drove him backward. Pratt fired a harpoon at contact range. The bolt seated in its sternum and discharged, collapsing the adult against him hard enough to pin his left arm. The second caught his right arm at the elbow and wrenched. Steel screamed. The arm tore free at the shoulder, trailing shredded tissue. Pratt reversed, trying to pull clear. His interface signal flared across my display, the tissue in his engine contracting toward the matriarch as if answering her. The third came from below. The floor opened under his feet. His mech dropped to the waist, and the adult above drove a shovel limb through the exposed shoulder housing. "Right wall held," Pratt said. The creature twisted. The power trunk tore loose and his signal died. His fall opened the center right of the formation. "Torrance, cover left!" I fired my harpoon into the adult bearing down on me. The bolt locked into the plate and released its impulse. The creature folded around the shaft. More dropped through the space Pratt had left. Torrance pivoted. His damaged actuator seized, locking the right leg straight. He caught himself against the cavity wall, braced the foot on a ridge, and swept the left flank in controlled bursts. "Left is closed," he said. "Don't cross behind me." He shifted his leg downslope. The locked knee stayed fixed. Its housing tore open, exposing the organic bundles around the joint. 2 adults surfaced on either side of it. One hooked the steel shin and pulled. The other broke away the ledge supporting Torrance's hand. He fired downward, but the cannon couldn't depress far enough to reach the limb around his ankle. I stepped toward him. A 4th ossivore landed between us and took my burst across its chest. By the time it fell, Torrance was sliding. He pitched into a trough with the first adult still anchored to his leg. The second followed and drove both shovel limbs into the walls, collapsing rock inward. "Marking the seam," Torrance said. A target indicator appeared over the thinner rock beside the matriarch's root mass. "It runs to center." The trough filled. His comms carried 3 impacts and the long complaint of a torso frame taking weight it couldn't shed. His transponder held for 4 seconds under the rubble. Then the pressure reached the core, and the signal flattened. Marsh and I stood back to back partway between the cavity wall and the matriarch. His cannon was firing in controlled bursts, sweeping the wall to our right where 4 more adults were massing. My cannon was running low. The ammunition counter on my display read 42 rounds. 42 rounds against dozens of ossivores. The matriarch remained at the center of her network, feeling everything. Our positions, our movements, our weapons fire. Every action we took traveled through the tissue in our mechs, through the shared channel, into the network, into her. She could see us the way I could see the rock through my interface. We were broadcasting our own deaths. "Marsh, listen. The tissue is how she's tracking us. As long as the organic systems are active, she can read everything we do. I'm going to sever the interface. Shut down the organic drivetrain. Run on backup hydraulics only. She won't be able to track me through the tissue." Silence on the channel. Marsh understood what I was saying. Backup hydraulics meant half speed, a fraction of the strength, no seismic sensing. I'd be piloting a steel skeleton with manual controls. The dormant tissue would disappear from the matriarch's network. "I can't do the same," Marsh said. "My Mech's locomotion is full organic integration. I shut down the tissue. I don't move at all. She's tracking you right now. Through the tissue, she knows exactly where I am." "Then you're the loudest signal in this cavity. I draw them. You kill her." "Marsh, wait. Kill the matriarch, Captain, while they're chasing me." He charged. Marsh's engine broke from our position at full sprint, cannon blazing, driving into the Ossivore line on the right wall. His active tissue made him the brightest target in the cavity. The matriarch's network tightened toward him. Every Ossivore turned. He hit the first adult shoulder first, drove it backward, and fired through the seam under its jaw. A second came from the wall at hip height. He caught it on his forearm and threw it into the pair behind it. "6 moving with me," he said. "Now 8. The guard ring is opening on your side." I pulled off the headset. The spatial world died. Pressure, direction, awareness of the rock, gone. The tissue in my mech spasmed once, then sagged over the steel frame. I engaged the backup hydraulics. The mech jerked forward slow and stiff, pumps grinding against the weight of dormant muscle. Half speed, a quarter of the strength. No tissue sensing. The matriarch had lost my precise position on the tissue network. Marsh climbed the broken east wall. The swarm followed in a rising spiral. His thermal lance cut into the shelf above them. Stone came down through the pack. 2 contacts vanished. 3 came through the rubble, and 1 tore open the tissue over his right calf. "Right actuator losing pressure," he said. "More leaving the wall." I started the slow walk to center. An adult reached his left side. Marsh drove the lance into its mouth and held the beam until light showed through the back of its skull. Another struck before he withdrew it. The lance arm bent and went dark. "Lance gone. Cannon 12. The matriarch's head stayed turned toward him. Only 2 adults remained near her flanks. Marsh reversed toward the fissure where we'd entered. The swarm crossed above the matriarch to follow. His damaged leg struck short. An Ossivore caught the trailing foot. He dropped to one knee and shot the hook off at the joint. "Opening is clear," he said. The pack reached him together. One landed across his shoulders, another drove into his hip and smashed him against the wall. His cannon fired from under them. 4 shots, 2, 1. "Marsh, move now." "I stay here. If I move, they redistribute." The adult on his shoulders peeled back the dorsal armor. Living tissue came away in a sheet, still contracting toward the matriarch. Marsh's interface signal flared through the exposed trunk. He used it. With his functioning arm, he seized the creature at his hip and drove both of them into the fissure mouth. His engine wedged the passage. The swarm piled onto the signal, bodies blocking bodies. "Center is yours." Rock cracked around him. The comm channel filled with armor grinding and drive tissue tearing from steel. "Kill the matriarch, Captain." His transponder remained active as I reached the first chord of the root network. I did not look back. Then his core warning sounded once. Power dropped to emergency. The swarm closed over his cockpit, and the signal went dark. I kept moving toward the matriarch. She sat at the center of the tissue network, her massive body motionless except for the slow contraction waves traveling through the root structure that connected her to the walls. Without the interface, I couldn't feel the network anymore. I could only see it. Sheets of cultivated tissue spread across the rock, the wrecked chassis of old mechs embedded like fossils in the living growth, thick cords of muscle running from each wreck into the matriarch's body. Torrance's last marker still pulsed on the manual display, fixed over the thinner seam where the root structure crossed the floor. I steered toward it. I brought the rotary cannon up. 38 rounds remaining. I aimed at the densest concentration of tissue, the root structure where the harvested muscle converged on the matriarch's torso, and fired. The rounds tore into the tissue. Fiber split, fluid sprayed from severed vessels. The network convulsed, a visible shudder that traveled outward from the point of impact, racing across the walls of the cavity. The matriarch's body shifted. Her head swung toward the source of damage. She couldn't place me on the network. Her vibration sensors caught the cannon echoes bouncing off every surface, but the cavity scattered them. She searched for the source of the impacts while the biological signal remained absent. She swept the area. One shovel limb rose, extended, crashed down 30 meters to my left. Rock shattered. She struck again, 20 meters to my right. Searching, bracketing, each impact threw rubble across the cavity floor, fragments pinging off my Mech's hull. I switched to the thermal lance. The beam cut into the root structure, burning through tissue in a line of intense heat. The network contracted violently wherever the lance touched, muscle fibers pulling away from the burn like a hand recoiling from a hot surface. I swept the beam across the thickest cords connecting the old Mechs to the matriarch. They parted. Dead tissue sloughed off the rock in wet sheets. The matriarch screamed. I didn't hear it through audio. The sound travelled through the dead tissue in my Mech's frame. A resonance that vibrated the dormant muscle, travelled through the steel skeleton into the cockpit walls. Even with the interface severed, the tissue was still Ossivore. It still registered the matriarch's distress signal at a level below any instrument I carried. She found me. The sustained heat and seismic footprint of the lance gave her my position through ordinary vibration. She navigated by vibration. The moment I lit the beam, I announced myself through the simplest channel available. Stealth lasted only as long as silence. Her head dropped toward me. 40 meters of armored bone, accelerating. I planted my Mech's feet. The backup hydraulics screamed under the load. I brought the cannon up and spent the last rounds into her face. 26 shots that struck bone plate, cratered it, blew fragments loose but didn't penetrate. Her skull was the thickest armor on her body. The rounds bought me 2 seconds as she flinched. She hit me with the right shovel limb. A lateral sweep, faster than anything that size should move. The impact caught my Mech's left side, shoulder, arm, torso plating. The arm assembly sheared off at the joint. Steel bolts snapped. The shoulder housing crumpled. My Mech spun a quarter turn, skidded across the rock, hit the base of the cavity wall. Warning indicators covered my display. Left arm, gone. Left torso plating, compromised. Hydraulic pressure, dropping. Coolant, leaking from 3 points. I still had the thermal lance. I still had one harpoon bolt. The matriarch was above me now, turning, lowering her head for a second strike. Her underbelly was exposed. The ventral surface where the bone plating was thinnest, where the tissue network's largest conduit entered her body through a junction of raw muscle. I aimed the harpoon. The bolt was a 3-meter steel shaft designed to anchor in solid rock at hypersonic velocity. At this range, less than 15 meters, it would hit with enough force to penetrate hull plating on a warship. I had one shot. If I missed the junction, the bolt would bounce off her ventral armor and I'd be underneath 40 meters of Ossivore with nothing left to fight with. She lunged. I fired. The bolt struck the junction point. It penetrated the thin ventral plate, drove through the tissue conduit, and locked into the mineral framework beneath. The seismic charge fired. The impulse entered the matriarch through the same structure that carried every signal out of her. The conduit snapped tight around the shaft. A contraction ran away from the impact, reached the root mass, then came back from every connected chassis at once. The network pulled in opposing directions. Cords of harvested muscle tore loose from the walls. Old Mech frames shifted in their beds of tissue, steel scraping across stone as the whole cavity answered out of sequence. The matriarch's body locked rigid. One forelimb struck towards me and stopped halfway through the motion, suspended for an instant above the floor. The Ossivores nearest her broke formation before she fell. 2 collided in the open space, each correcting for a command that no longer matched the other. Her forward momentum carried her over my Mech. Her mass, hundreds of tons of mineralized bone, came down on my machine. The cockpit held. It was the most heavily armored component in the entire engine, designed to survive impacts that destroyed everything around it. The rest of the chassis was not. Steel bent, buckled, collapsed. The Mech's legs folded. The torso housing crumpled around me. I was inside a metal coffin being crushed by the weight of the thing I'd killed. The pressure stopped. The matriarch was still. Dead weight on dead steel. The cavity went quiet. Through the viewport, cracked now, spider-webbed with fracture lines, I could see the tissue network dying. The contractions had stopped. The sheets of muscle across the walls were going slack, losing their tension, sagging off the rock in curtains of grey fibre. The connection between the matriarch and the harvested mechs was severed. The conduit I'd destroyed was the central link. Without it, the network was just dead meat on stone. The Ossivores on the walls scattered away from me into the fissures, boreholes and tunnels branching off the cavity in every direction. Without the matriarch's coordination, without the network feeding them information, they were reverting to what they'd been before. Animals. Pack predators, without a pack structure. They fled into the rock the way any creature flees when the thing holding it together disappears. I keyed the comm. Marsh, answer me. Static. Marsh, respond. Nothing. His signal was gone. His Mech's transponder, the automated beacon that broadcast identity, position, status, was dark. The dark transponder meant the Mech's core systems had failed. Everything after that was just physics. I sat in the crushed cockpit for a while. The displays were mostly dead. Emergency lighting cast the interior in dim red. The air recycler was still running on its own battery. I had maybe 6 hours of breathable atmosphere in the sealed cockpit. After that, I'd need to be somewhere else. I popped the emergency release on the cockpit hatch. The bolts blew. The hatch didn't open. The matriarch's body was pressing on it. I kicked it again. On the third attempt, it shifted enough for me to squeeze through the gap, scraping past crushed steel into the narrow space between my mech's wrecked torso and the matriarch's ventral surface. I dropped to the cavity floor. The rock was warm under my boots, residual heat from the matriarch's body, from the dying tissue, from the thermal lance burns still cooling in the walls. I was carrying a sidearm, an emergency beacon, a headlamp, 2 water flasks. My ribs hurt on the left side, cracked probably from the impact when she'd hit me. My right shoulder burned where I'd torqued it, bracing against the cockpit frame during the crush. I activated the beacon. It would broadcast for 72 hours, but this deep it would die unheard unless I reached Broward's carrier. I started walking. The fissures above the cavity were passable on foot. My headlamp crossed glassed rock and dead tissue. My ribs ground when I climbed. The shoulder stiffened as the adrenaline faded. I kept the beacon off except at junctions, conserving the cell and checking the mission markers stored in it. I crossed the annex most of a day later and reached Tier 7 with 1 flask empty. Broward opened the pump room door only after I transmitted our identification sequence twice. He looked past me. The others? I'm the only one. He got my right arm across his shoulders and pulled me inside. A pipeworker's maintenance brace and pressure webbing kept my ribs from shifting and fixed the shoulder against my chest. Then he connected my beacon to the pump carrier and drove its signal into the western main. Our return window had expired 9 hours earlier. Broward had already been transmitting the mission code in short bursts. My beacon added Pershing authentication and the squad's casualty flag. A recovery force had left when we missed our report. 1 engine and an armoured medical carrier. At the choke point, they found 4 gate trails in the rubble, one dragging a damaged knee, and followed them into the branch. They caught the amplified signal west of Macon. Their floodlights reached the pump corridor 14 hours after I returned. Broward made them transmit the identification sequence 3 times before opening the door. I rode back to Pershing in an observer seat. Broward rode in the medical carrier, with more than 8 days of pressure logs and the only surviving civilian account of Macon's destruction. The interface headset hung on its rack 2 feet from my face. I didn't touch it. Hargrove debriefed me in the same concrete room where he'd given me the mission, same projection table, same fluorescent strips. He stood across from me while I told him everything: the cavity, the matriarch, the tissue network built from harvested mechs, the shared sensory channel that had turned every Marrow engine in the field into a beacon. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he set his data pad on the table. "We suspected," he said. I looked at him. We suspected the vulnerability but lacked proof. The pattern analysis out of the tactical section flagged the tissue channel as a potential vulnerability 8 months ago. The correlation between mech deployment routes and subsequent Ossivore attack vectors was too consistent to be coincidence. 8 months. The Macon Research Annex was working on a countermeasure, methods for severing the biological link between cultivated tissue and wild ossivore populations. That was the real priority of the program. Faster growth rates and better yield were secondary. He met my eyes. The Annex was trying to solve this before it killed us. The tissue they were growing, those cultures in the tanks, were experimental samples with modified genetic markers designed to block the sensory channel. The Ossivores destroyed the data, killed the researchers, and carried those cultures away. I sat with that. The matriarch hadn't just raided the Annex for raw material. She'd identified the one program that threatened her intelligence network, destroyed it completely, then stripped the experimental tissue for study. She'd been running a counterintelligence operation. If you knew the Mechs were compromised, I said, why are you still deploying them? What do you suggest we deploy instead, Captain? Hargrove asked. The answer was nothing. Without the Marrow Engines, the trench cities had no defense against the Ossivores. Infantry weapons couldn't penetrate adult bone plating. Tunnel fortifications slowed the beasts but didn't stop them. The Mechs were the only thing standing between 70,000 people in Pershing and the population of every other surviving trench city. And what had happened to Macon? The tissue link is a slow compromise, Hargrove said. It gives them information over time. Decommissioning the engines would give them everything immediately. Open tunnels, undefended cities. We're choosing between a leak we can manage and a breach we can't survive. You can't manage this. The matriarch I killed may not be the only one. The behavioral changes, the tactical coordination, we've seen them near other cities. If more matriarchs are building networks, then we need pilots in the field who know what to look for. Pilots who've seen a network and destroyed one. He paused. Your replacement frame was seeded before you launched. Integration finishes in 48 hours. Full hydraulic gate. Emergency only, same as your last chassis. Marsh couldn't move when he shut his tissue down. Half the engines in service can't. Every replacement frame gets independent locomotion. Dual-drive pilots learn to fight blind. Your frame isn't sealed. Dunlap can fit the packs before integration. Existing engine retrofits take 12 days, add mass, and reduce ammunition. Pershing has 2 operational machines until this one clears. Then do them one at a time. The interface needs a hard mechanical severance at the pilot station, not a software command through tissue that may be listening. Dunlap gets Colley's chassis and my rec data. No pilot enters a suspected network without a way to go dark. Hargrove studied me. The demand would leave Pershing below minimum coverage for weeks. Refusing it meant sending the next squad into the same cavity with no counterplay. Your frame first, he said. One existing engine at a time after that. Blackout movement is restricted to emergencies on dual-drive units. The engines stay active on perimeter. We do not advertise the vulnerability outside command channels. I stood up. My ribs sent a sharp protest through my left side. My shoulder ached from the base of my neck to my elbow. Broward was alive because we'd left him behind a door. Marsh was dead. Torrance was dead. Pratt was dead. The thing that had killed them was the thing we couldn't stop using. 48 hours later, I went down to the foundry. The new mech stood in its growth cradle. A steel skeleton wrapped in fresh ossivore tissue, still raw, still settling into the frame. The muscle was pink where it hadn't yet calcified into the tougher outer layer. Secondary hydraulic packs thickened the hips and knees. Inside the open cockpit, a guarded mechanical cutoff sat below the neural headset mount. I picked up the headset. It was lighter than my old one. Newer design. Better contact points for the interface pads. I put it on. The spatial world opened. Pressure in every direction. The rock around Pershing, the rift, the tunnels, the deep strata below. The tissue in the new mech responded to the interface, translated the vibration data into the awareness I'd spent 12 years learning to trust. I could feel the city and the perimeter. Far below, in the deep rock where the branch tunnel descended toward the ruins of Macon, I felt movement. Something down there. something that had felt me connect. The tissue in the new mech tightened, a contraction in the deep fibers, not under my control. A response, a recognition. I knew what it was and what it cost. Every second I wore the headset, whatever was down there could see Pershing through my mech's tissue the way I could see the rock through it. The channel was open. It had always been open. I climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, powered up the drivetrain. The mech's organic musculature engaged, wrapped around the steel bones, lifted the machine off the cradle. I closed the cockpit hatch. The war hadn't changed. We were still the only thing between the cities and the dark. The cost of fighting was feeding the enemy everything it needed to win. The cost of stopping was dying tonight instead of tomorrow. I chose tomorrow.